Let's talk about the 70 years before the American Civil War. In this period, America went through one of the most radical economic transformations in history. A quiet, mostly agricultural nation was completely reforged into an industrial powerhouse, and we're going to dive into how that happened. So how on earth does that happen? How does a country of isolated farms and tiny workshops become this interconnected industrial giant, all in the span of a single human life? Well, the answer is a fascinating, complex story of massive change.
It really boils down to three huge revolutions happening all at once. First, a revolution in people, where they were from and where they were headed. Second, a revolution in production, how things were actually made. And third, a revolution in connection, how people and all those new goods moved across a vast continent.
These three forces all collided and combined to forge a brand new, dynamic, market-driven system that would really define America for the next century. The writer Ralph Waldo Emerson just captured the feeling of the era perfectly. He got that new technology, like the railroad, wasn't just about moving stuff faster. It was fundamentally rewiring society, politics, and the very idea of what America was.
So the core idea we're digging into here is what historians call the market revolution. Basically, it was this massive shift away from self-sufficient households, where you grew your own food, made your own clothes, to a world where people worked for wages and bought things that were made by strangers, often in factories hundreds of miles away.
And it all started with people. Just incredible waves of movement, both inside the country and from overseas, provided the muscle and the energy for this whole new economy. Try to wrap your head around just how young the nation was back then. Half the population, under 30. America was young, it was energetic, it was restless, and it was constantly on the move, pushing steadily westward as millions of people looked for cheap land and new opportunities. But we have to be careful to separate the legend from the reality. The popular image was of these heroic, muscular pioneers taming the wilderness. The truth for most people was pretty grim. Poorly built shacks, bad food, and a crushing, unbearable loneliness, especially for women, who were often stuck in total isolation for weeks on end.
This westward push got supercharged by immigration. Just look at these numbers. They absolutely explode in the 1840s and 50s. A horrific potato famine in Ireland drove millions to escape, while political chaos in Germany sent over 1.5 million people looking for a more stable life in America.
But these new arrivals weren't exactly welcomed with open arms. The Irish, especially, were often desperately poor, they were Catholic, and they were packed into filthy city slums. They faced intense prejudice, summed up by this sign, which was a common sight at factory gates. A lot of native-born workers saw them as competition that would drive down wages for everyone.
Okay, so this growing population needed stuff, tools, clothes, you name it. And that brings us to our second revolution, an incredible wave of invention that totally transformed how Americans worked, both in the factories and out on the farms.
It is really hard to overstate the impact of Eli Whitney's cotton gin. By making it so much easier to separate the seeds from raw cotton, it turned cotton into a ridiculously profitable crop. But that prosperity came at a terrible, terrible price. It created this insatiable demand for enslaved labor that breathed new life into the institution of slavery and spread it all across the South.
And here is the great, bitter irony. The very same inventor, Eli Whitney, also came up with the idea of interchangeable parts to mass-produce muskets. This idea became the foundation of all modern mass production, and it gave the industrial North an economic and military edge that would be absolutely decisive in the Civil War.
This chart just says it all, doesn't it? It shows this absolute explosion of American creativity. In the 1790s, the U.S. Patent Office approved just over 300 patents. By the 1850s, that number had skyrocketed to nearly 28,000. It was a true golden age of American invention.
But this new industrial world also created a new kind of worker. At so-called showplace factories like the famous Lowell Mills, young women from farms were treated less like people and more like cogs in a machine. They lived this exhausting, highly controlled life, working brutal hours for low pay with basically zero power to change their situation.
And this revolution wasn't just happening inside factory walls. Oh no. Out west, amazing new inventions like John Deere's tough steel plow and Cyrus McCormick's mechanical reaper allowed a single farmer to cultivate huge new areas of land,
transforming the entire region into the nation's breadbasket.
So we have a nation in motion and an engine of production. But how do you connect it all?
How do you tie it together?
Well, that brings us to our third and final revolution, a series of transportation breakthroughs that literally wove the sprawling nation together.
I mean, just look at how fast all this happened. It was one thing after another. First, you get a boom in building roads, or turnpikes. Then the steamboat comes along and turns rivers into two-way highways. Then comes the great era of canals. And finally, the ultimate game changer, the railroad. Each one built on the last, shrinking the massive distances of the American continent.
If you want to understand the sheer economic power of these new connections, you don't have to look any further than the Erie Canal. Before it opened, shipping 1 ton of grain from Buffalo to New York City cost $100. Afterwards, that cost plummeted to just $5. It was a complete and total game changer.
But ultimately, it was the railroad, the Iron Horse, that truly tied the nation together. By 1860, there were 30,000 miles of track crisscrossing the country. And here's the crucial detail. 3/4 of all that track was in the north, forging powerful economic bonds between the industrial East and the agricultural West.
So, let's put it all together. What was the result of all this mind-bending change? What did this new American economy actually look like?
Well, by the eve of the Civil War, a whole new continental division of labor had emerged. Each region basically had its own specialty. The South grew the cotton, the West produced the food to feed everyone, and the East manufactured the machines and textiles for the other two regions. They were all deeply interconnected, creating one powerful, interdependent national market.
Now, this new market created immense wealth and opportunity, but it was not shared equally, not even close. For the very first time, America saw a huge gap opening up between the ultra-wealthy, guys like the fur trader John Jacob Astor, and the poor, unskilled workers who were just barely scraping by at the bottom.
So here's the ultimate paradox. The market revolution wove the nation together with canals, railroads, and business. Southerners bet their future on these connections, thinking that the mighty Mississippi River would forever bind the West to their cause. But they fatally miscalculated the power of those new man-made links, the iron and steam, that now tied the West's prosperity firmly to the East. And this left the nation with one final, chilling question as it hurtled towards civil war.